Hey guys, today we begin with a journey that's not only historical, but, well, a little weird. So, before starting the interesting story, if you love your mom, then like this video and comment, "I love mom," and subscribe my channel, so get back. Topic: Welcome to the secret life of the great American railroads, because, let's be honest, we don't talk about railroads nearly enough. And what better way to settle in for a sleepy, late-night ramble than with a tale of iron tracks, steam whistles, and a century or so of absolutely ridiculous decisions by men with way too much time and too little sense. So, dim the lights, grab a cozy blanket, and let's get into it. We're about to talk about how a bunch of ambitious guys, armed with little more than a serious lack of understanding of the limits of human endurance, decided to build the first railroads in America. And naturally, this didn't go entirely according to plan, but of course, what would history be without a little chaos and unintended consequences? All right, let's wind the clock back a bit. Picture it, the early 1800s. The United States is still in its awkward adolescence. The country is vast, untamed, and, let's face it, a bit behind the rest of the world in terms of infrastructure. Sure, they've got a growing nation, a shaky economy, and a bunch of people still figuring out how to get from point A to point B without walking for days. But they have, well, nothing else, really. The roads. A hot mess of muddy tracks that disappear when it rains. And let's not even talk about the waterways, that's a whole other disaster waiting to happen now. Enter the steam engine, the crown jewel of 18th century technology. Sure, people had seen the thing work over in England, but Americans, well, they were too busy reinventing the wheel and figuring out how to grow cotton at breakneck speeds to be all that interested. But eventually, a few ambitious minds came together to do what they did best. Take a good idea, slap some American ingenuity on it, and mess it up in the most spectacularly inefficient way possible. It started with men like John Stevens, a New Jersey lawyer and inventor, who took a long look at steam engines and thought, this could work on land, right? Naturally, people told him it was crazy. And by people, I mean everyone who wasn't John Stevens. I mean, sure, it made sense in theory. Why walk or ride a horse when you could just, sit down in a moving metal box while it clattered along a set of tracks? What could go wrong? Well, quite a bit, actually. But we'll get to that in 1825. Stevens managed to get a prototype working sort of. It was a steam-powered locomotive called the Pioneer, which, by all accounts, was a pretty basic piece of machinery. I mean, we're not talking about the Titanic of trains here. No, this thing was more like a slightly overzealous firecracker on wheels. But hey, it was something. And so, with much fanfare and just a touch of desperation, Stevens decided to see if people were interested in using it. The first test run was a complete and utter mess. Shocking, I know. They couldn't get it to go faster than a leisurely stroll. The boiler kept overheating because, basic safety was still a suggestion, and nobody even knew what to do when the steam began to make that strange, ominous, hissing sound. But, despite all that, some folks in the crowd were impressed, mainly because they had no other frame of reference. After all, this was a time when the fastest means of transportation was a horse, and most people still relied on a trusty pair of legs to get them where they needed to go. So, the train was hailed as a technological marvel, or at least, it was a step up from walking. Meanwhile, other cities were taking notice, but let's be clear, everyone was skeptical. I mean, trains on tracks. Sure, they could barely keep a horse-drawn carriage from toppling over, but now we're talking about throwing a giant steam-powered metal monstrosity onto fragile wooden tracks. What could go wrong? And of course, this is where the first royal disaster in railroad history began to unfold. As railroads began to spread, particularly to the major cities of the Northeast. The real chaos was just beginning. We can talk about expansion and great strides forward and massive innovations, but the truth is, these trains weren't exactly safe. I mean, we've all seen those old movies with the slow-motion train crashes, right? Yeah, those were real. And they weren't even the worst part, you see. There's something about the railroad industry that attracts the weirdest, most dysfunctional group of people land. Not in a charming, quirky way. No, these people were essentially the prototypes of what we now call problematic billionaires. Imagine someone so obsessed with the idea of being the next big thing, that they were willing to throw money into something without fully thinking through the consequences. These are the people who turned a potentially useful invention into a roller coaster of societal chaos. Take, for example, Cornelius Vanderbilt. This guy had one goal in mind: become the biggest, most powerful railroad magnate in America. And did he do it? Oh, you bet he did. But was it smooth sailing? Absolutely not. Let's just say that to get where he ended up, he bulldozed a few egos, skirted some laws, and, in the process, became the textbook definition of a guy you wouldn't want to share a train car with by the time Vanderbilt was done. He had essentially monopolized the railroad industry, controlling the paths people took, the goods that moved, and, to some extent, the very idea of what an American railroad could be. And how did he do it? Well, mostly by throwing money at it, throwing people under the train metaphorically, not literally, well, mostly, and, for lack of a better term, bullying his way through the competitive landscape. Meanwhile, out west, things weren't much better. The story of the Transcontinental Railroad is, of course, one of progress, but progress at what cost? You know, just a little bit of human tragedy and unprecedented levels of exploitation. So, what happens when you bring together the great American dream, steam-powered locomotives, and a complete disregard for basic human decency? You get the mess that was the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. But we're not there yet. Right now, let's just bask in the glowing charm of the early days of the railroad, where every puff of steam was a promise of progress, and every train crash was a reminder that maybe, just maybe, the people in charge didn't know what they were doing. But hey, who's to say this wasn't part of the charm? The steam-powered chaos, all right? Let's keep this lazy journey moving. Now, where were we? Oh right, the shiny new railroads of the 19th century. At this point, you've probably got a nice, cozy image in your head of those early trains, steam-belching creatures that somehow got the job done, even if it took a few too many explosive mishaps along the way. But now, let's move over to the real chaos. The thing about these trains, especially in the mid-1800s, is that they weren't just about moving people from place to place. No, no, no. They were also about something much more important: money. And if there's one thing that guarantees a disaster in any historical period, it's greed. The real issue came when folks decided that the best way to make a quick buck from railroads was to control the very tracks they ran on, which, unsurprisingly, led to a lot of questionable decisions. Let's talk about railroad barons, shall we? These were the guys who saw an iron horse, and instead of asking how they could improve it, they saw dollar signs instead of wheels. One such man was Jay Gould, who, as the legend goes, had a particular knack for buying up failing railroads, manipulating stock prices, and becoming obscenely wealthy. He was a classic 19th century American villain in the making. Gould's genius, if you want to call it, that was in his ability to buy up these railroads, strip them of whatever valuable resources they had, and leave behind a network of crumbling, poorly managed tracks. Imagine someone who buys a car, drives it into the ground, and then sells it for a profit. without ever fixing the engine or worrying about safety. That was essentially the railroad industry under Jay Gould's watch. But hey, if you can make a buck off the wreckage, why not, right? It's not like there were laws about corporate malfeasance back then. Oh wait, there weren't. But, of course, it wasn't just about stealing money through stock manipulation. No, these barons weren't afraid to get their hands dirty in a more literal sense too. They weren't all the sharpest tools in the shed. When it came to practical matters, like safety or even basic comfort, for example, the sleeping cars, which were supposed to be these luxurious train compartments, where weary travelers could, rest, ended up being more like sardine cans on wheels. Not only did these things get packed with people like a can of beans, but the luxury was mostly just a piece of cloth nailed to the walls. Real relaxing, huh? And you think modern-day train travel is a pain? Back in the day, you were lucky. If you weren't thrown against a wall when the train made a turn, they had no idea what they were doing half the time. Safety standards, more like safety suggestions. Comfort was also a relative term. If you think today's overcrowded commuter trains are bad, imagine being jammed into a train car for days, with nothing but a tiny window and a smell that can only be described as a cross between bad cheese and damp wood. So, yeah, not quite the glamorous vision we have of rail travel today, but these early American railroads had one thing going for them. They were ambitious as hell. They were trying to connect all of America, from the East Coast to the West, which at the time seemed just impossible. It was like looking at a giant blank map and deciding, yeah, let's just draw a line from New York to California and build a highway for trains along it. But just in case you were starting to think this whole thing was like a noble pursuit, let's talk about the Transcontinental Railroad. This is the big one, the massive endeavor that eventually linked the eastern US to the West. I know, it sounds like a great feat of engineering, like something we should all praise. But, well, let's just say the history books tend to skip over some of the not-so-great parts of it. Enter the Central Pacific Railroad, which was responsible for building the tracks west from California. The first thing you need to know about the Central Pacific is that they decided to employ Chinese immigrants in massive numbers, which, by the way, was definitely more about cheap labor than any deep, humane appreciation for cultural diversity. These workers were treated terribly. They were paid much less than their white counterparts, given the most dangerous jobs, and, oh yeah, thousands of them died due to bad working conditions. But hey, who cares about that when there's a railroad to build, right? Meanwhile, on the other side, the Union Pacific Railroad was tasked with building the tracks east from Nebraska. These guys had a bit of a different approach. They brought in Irish immigrants, and once again, these workers were treated like they were worth about as much as the dirt they dug through. It's almost like these two railroads were in a race to see who could exploit the most people for the least amount of money. So, it wasn't exactly a Disneyland of opportunity. So, what do you get when you mix a lot of ambition, a lack of safety regulations, and exploitative labor practices? Well, you get a bunch of people working themselves to death, literally, in order to build a railroad that would change the country forever. It's not glamorous, and frankly, it's kind of a downer. But that's the reality of American history sometimes. Progress, as they say, isn't always pretty. And yet, despite all the death, the danger, and the greed, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869. And when it was finished, they held this big OL ceremony to celebrate. Everyone stood around, clinking glasses and patting themselves on the back for connecting to coasts. But here's the kicker: no one even mentioned the thousands of men who died to make it happen. It's almost like, after all that suffering, the only thing worth celebrating was the fact that they could now ship things faster. Priorities, huh? Now, let's float over to another royal disaster. I mean, another railroad catastrophe. You see, by this point, the railroad industry was booming. But here's the thing, the boom had some serious side effects. While the railroads were expanding, so was the corruption. These guys were grabbing all the land they could, building railroads wherever they wanted, and then charging businesses and everyday people to use them. And let me tell you, charging a ton of money for a service that's, let's be honest, still pretty risky was a winning business model for them. There was even a point when one of the biggest rail companies decided to go ahead and build tracks straight through Indian territory because why not? No one's gonna stop them. So yeah, that didn't go over too well either. But who's gonna tell the guys with the billion-dollar train systems, right? Certainly not the people who had to deal with the aftermath. The Gilded Age and the rise of the railroad giants. All right, let's keep this leisurely train rolling. Now that we've got the whole chaos of construction out of the way, let's take a step back and talk about how the railroad business started to look a bit too good to be true. By the time the Transcontinental Railroad was done, railroads were everywhere in America. They were like the fast food chains of the industrial age, except instead of fries, they were serving up endless freight and somewhat questionable passenger service. And guess what? Everyone wanted in on it. Cue the Gilded Age. That glorious period in the late 1800s when America's elite decided to see just how much they could enrich themselves without actually doing anything. That resembled hard work. Railroads were the gold mine, the get-rich-quick scheme of the century. And if you could get your hands on one, you could pretty much buy yourself a palace. All you had to do was figure out a way to make everyone else pay for it. By now, the railroad barons had figured out a few things. First of all, it helped if you were an absolutely horrible human being. But it also helped if you were willing to bend, break, and occasionally snap the law to get what you wanted. The thing about these guys, Cornelius Vanderbilt, James J. Hill, and their pulses, that they were about as subtle as a wrecking ball in a fine china shop. They didn't just run railroads, they owned entire economies. Take Cornelius Vanderbilt, for example. This guy practically ruled the railroad industry by the end of his life. How did he do it? Well, mostly by being an absolute jerk. He didn't play nice with other railroad moguls, and he certainly didn't care about the little people who had to actually ride his trains. Vanderbilt's vision of the railroad was like this: dominate, dominate, dominate. He made a habit of buying up smaller, struggling railroads, driving the prices up, and then raising fares so high that taking a train became a luxury only the wealthy could afford. So, you know, standard 19th century capitalism, Vanderbilt's personal life though, well, that was just as charming as his business tactics. He wasn't exactly known for his warmth or affection. In fact, he treated his family with as much consideration as a butcher treats a slab of meat. His wife, Catherine, reportedly spent most of her time feeling neglected and unhappy, while Vanderbilt was busy building his railroad empire. In fact, when Catherine passed away, Vanderbilt didn't exactly hold a long memorial service. Instead, he just remarried as soon as possible. After all, why wait when there's so much railroading to be done? But hey, at least he was successful. He got to build the New York Central Railroad, one of the largest railroads in the country, and leave behind a dynasty built on broken promises and questionable ethics. But hey, it's not like the man had a great sense of social responsibility. His legacy? Well, it was a railroad system that literally ran through the lives of everyday Americans, only to smash through their wallets while doing so. As Vanderbilt's grip on the railroads tightened, other barons followed suit. They built empires, not on goodwill or better service, but on sheer, brutal monopoly. There's a certain kind of quiet genius to it, though. If you can get past the utter disregard for anyone who wasn't in the elite class, while these railroads were expanding at lightning speed, their customers, well, they were paying for the privilege of being crammed into tiny compartments, for the luxury of riding on a train that smelled like iron and sweat. Sounds wonderful, right? Let's float over to another royal disaster. I mean, another baron. Jay Gould, the man who had mastered the art of manipulating the stock market with his railroad investments. Gould was definitely one of those two. Smart for his own good types, who knew how to make a quick buck off the weaknesses of the railroad system, and of course, the people running it. He famously bought up railroads in distress, and instead of fixing them up or improving service, he just turned around and manipulated their stock prices to his advantage. Gould's accomplishments included swindling people into buying shares in railroads that had little to no actual value. And when you're buying shares in a railroad that's essentially running on fumes, you're really just signing up for a train wreck in every sense of the word. Of course, he wasn't just in it for the money. He was also determined to crush anyone who dared to challenge his dominance. It's said that Gould was particularly fond of making his competitors squirm, just for fun. It wasn't just about business, it was about power. But let's talk about the people who actually used these railroads, shall we? After all, we can't just ignore the passengers who were being carried along this railroad-induced roller coaster of nightmares. The thing about these early train rides is that they were anything but comfortable. Imagine being packed into a small wooden car with no air conditioning, sitting next to a bunch of strangers, all of you rattling along for hours on end. The sounds were probably deafening. Chug, chug, whistle blow. Click, clack, hand, the air was thick with smoke from the engines. It wasn't exactly the Hilton experience, but here's where it gets good. Despite the complete and utter discomfort, trains became the lifeblood of America's growing economy. The country was expanding rapidly, and if you wanted to transport anything, you needed a train. From coal to cattle, from wheat to wine. The railroad had become the ultimate method of getting goods across the country, even if you had to endure a few hundred miles of utter chaos to get there. It was like the Old West on tracks, wild, untamed, and seemingly unstoppable. Now, what's funny is that while the railroads were all about expanding and dominating the economic landscape, their very success also created a massive amount of dysfunction. The more railroads there were, the more competition there was. And suddenly it wasn't just a friendly, I'll make more money than you kind of deal. Nope, this was cutthroat, backstabbing, corporate warfare. And it wasn't long before things started to collapse under the weight of greed. In fact, by the late 1800s, these railroad wars and the corruption they entailed were causing serious problems. Railroads were building in areas where they weren't needed, just to block out the competition, and companies were overpromising and under-delivering on services. Of course, none of this really mattered to the people who controlled it. They were still raking in the money, living their rich, gilded lives, while the average person was left to deal with subpar service and ever-increasing prices. Some things never change, so, as the railroad revolution kept chugging along, powered by the greed of men like Gould and Vanderbilt, we're left with the quirky reality of American railroads. They were, at their core, a great symbol of American ingenuity and progress. But they also represented the absolute worst aspects of that progress: greed, exploitation, and a complete disregard for the people who were left in their wake. And no, that's not an oversimplification, folks. That's just how the rails rolled. Final whistle, all right. Let's wrap up this bumpy ride, shall we? Now, by the late 19th century, we've come to a point where the railroads have more or less settled into their role in America. They were no longer the shiny new thing. They were a part of everyday life, like coffee in the morning or the constant buzz of a fly that you can't quite get rid of. The railroads had become as American as apple pie and unnecessary wars. And they were the backbone of the country's economy, whether people wanted them to be or not. But here's the thing. While the railroads were undeniably powerful and useful, they were also about to hit a wall. It's almost like when a kid gets a toy that's way too big for them, and they spend the next few years getting stuck in it, making mistakes and wrecking everything along the way. By the early 20th century, the railroads were still dominating in terms of transportation, but there was one pesky little problem: the automobile. The car, the ultimate rival to the iron horse. It was like when that one friend starts showing up to parties with better snacks than yours. Suddenly, the trains, which had once been the most exciting, efficient way to travel across the country, were losing their shine. Not that anyone told the railroad barons about this. They were too busy trying to figure out how to sell overpriced tickets and monopolize even more routes. But no matter how hard they tried to stay relevant, they couldn't avoid the fact that a new era was coming by the 1920s. Railroads were no longer the preferred method of travel for most people. Cars were cheaper, faster, and let's face it, more comfortable. The massive, cold iron trains that once carried everything from cargo to passengers now began to look a little too slow and a little too loud. Let's face it, no one wanted to deal with the hassle of train schedules, crowded cars, and the occasional death trap derailment when you could just drive your own car to wherever you wanted to go. The golden age of railroads was officially coming to a slow, chugging end. And speaking of slow, let's take a moment to talk about the Grand Central Station, the most famous of train stations, which, at its peak, had a bit of a reputation for attracting chaos of its own. You see, in the early 20th century, Grand Central was the epitome of a grand experience. If by grand you mean overcrowded, overhyped, and kind of a mess. The station was packed with rich businessmen, tourists, and folks who just wanted to get out of the city as quickly as possible, while everyone else tried to avoid getting trampled. But that's the funny thing about railroads in America. Went from being the glory days of travel to an afterthought. Sure, trains still ran, and they still carried goods from coast to coast. But they were no longer the proud symbols of progress. The early pioneers who built their empires on iron rails and steam-powered machines had seen their time come and go, much like the trains themselves. The sound of a steam engine's whistle became less of a triumph and more of a whimper, almost like an elderly relative slowly fading into obscurity. Despite all this, though the railroads did leave behind one lasting legacy, they made America smaller, not physically. Of course, America is still a beast of a country, but in a cultural sense. The trains did something no other mode of transportation had done before. They connected people across vast distances. Towns that once felt isolated were now on the map, and, more importantly, those towns now had access to the products and goods that only the rich could get. Trains brought us all closer, in the sense that now we could all travel and buy stuff with much more ease, and that's something we can't entirely dismiss. But here's where the real fun begins. When the cars started taking over, it wasn't just the passengers that jumped ship. No, the railroads had a few more tricks up their sleeves. With the rise of automobiles, trains had to adapt, and they did. They turned into freight railroads. Because, as it turns out, while people may have abandoned them, stuff still needed to be moved. This led to a curious chapter in American railroad history, where they slowly transitioned from the once proud passenger services to becoming the underappreciated workhorses of the industrial world. Imagine going from being a glamorous star on the red carpet to a behind-the-scenes laborer in a dimly lit factory. Not exactly glamorous, but hey, still essential. These freight railroads carried everything: grain, coal, timber, oil, and, of course, all the junk we've been buying from Amazon. Without the freight railroads, it's safe to say we wouldn't be able to get things from one coast to another with the speed we're accustomed to today. So, while they may not have the sparkle and shine of the early days, they've quietly continued to serve America's industrial heart. But even with their practical purposes, the days of the grand, roaring iron beasts that once captured the imagination of the American people were gone. The flashy locomotives, the grand stations, the golden age of travel-it, all went away. Inch by inch, replaced by something faster, sleeker, and, let's face it, more convenient. The idea of packing up the family for a leisurely train trip became something of a quaint memory. People no longer marveled at the magic of the rails. They were more concerned with traffic jams and faster airports. So, in the end, what are we left with? A giant, slow-moving beast that became the backbone of America's economy, and then quietly faded into the background of history. The railroads still serve a purpose today, but they're no longer the glamorous symbols of progress they once were. And in a strange way, it's kind of fitting that the legacy of the great American railroads is so quiet. They were loud, once, and they made the world smaller, but they did it with such humble persistence that we hardly even noticed when they became the underdogs. And maybe that's the most fitting tribute to the trains. They were always there, quietly chugging away, holding the world together. No fanfare, no glory. Just a steady, dependable machine that knew what it was doing all along.